Excellencies, ministers, ladies and gentlemen, we are delighted to see you here at our 33rd Geneva Security Debate, here in Geneva, but also online. Today, we will be talking about the Geoeconomic Playbook of Global Trade at Geneva Security Debate. Each month, we unite the world's leading thinkers and practitioners for interactive discussions, and we hope these Geneva security debates will inform our policymakers here in Geneva, but also beyond with new insights and for joint reflection and networking. In the long run, we hope these debates will help us to shape a better global future together. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Christina Shori-Liang. I'm head of counterterrorism and PVE here at the GCSP, and I'm an adjunct faculty member at the Paris School of International Affairs. This Geneva Security Debate will be divided into 3 parts. At the outset, I will begin with a brief introduction to set the stage of the debate. And in the first part, we will focus on understanding the trade war. Part 2, we will focus on the consequences and repercussions of the trade war. In the third part, we will discuss the ethics of the trade war. We will discuss how free trade, we will look at also the ethics of trade war and versus free trade, and how we think what would be some of the best ways to rebalance the global trade system. Let me now begin to introduce my esteemed speakers. I will begin with them alphabetically. So Ali Ahmadi, Mr. Ali Ahmadi is a scholar of economic statecraft and sanctions policy. He studies the intersection of national security and global economic affairs and the growing use of sanctions in the context of world politics. He's also the director of geoeconomics and sanctions at Reshape Risk. Happily, he's also an executive in residence here at the GCSP, part of our Global Fellowship Initiative. So thank you. He also works with think tanks and institutions around the world on sanctions and geoeconomic related issues, including Gulf State Analytics in Washington and Voco Europe in Brussels. And he has a master's degree from the University of Tehran and a bachelor's degree from the City University of New York. Dr. Rolf Ossa, all the way to my left, is the chief economist and director of the Economic Research and Statistics Division at the World Trade Organization. He joined the WTO in January 2023 after a distinguished career in academia with appointments at Princeton University, the University of Chicago, and the University of Zurich. He is also a professor. As a professor, he is also focused on international economics with a particular emphasis on questions of policy relevance. For example, he has explored the economics of trade wars and trade talks and estimated how much countries gain from international trade. He holds a PhD in economics from the London School of Economics. So Dr. Ivan Ureta is our new director of executive education at the Geneva Center for Security Policy. He also serves as the president of the Swiss Business Ethics Network. He also collaborates with several prestigious business schools in Switzerland, Spain, and India. And his area of expertise include international political economy, geoeconomics, ethics, and responsible leadership, which he seamlessly integrates into his research training and executive training. So previously, Dr. Ureta led the executive education at SUPSI and has held academic and research positions in renowned institutions, including the IE Business School, King's College London, the Universities of Oxford and Cambridge. And he holds a PhD in economics history from the University of Deusto, a PhD in international relations from King's College. So indeed, a very, very esteemed group amongst me here. I'm very privileged. So let me begin with the introduction of setting the stage today's talks. So US President Donald Trump is rewriting the rule book on global trade that has been in place for the last 50 years. So global markets have dropped worldwide since Trump initially announced his reciprocal tariffs on April 2nd. On the 9th of April, Trump's higher reciprocal rates went into effect, hiking taxes on imports just after midnight from some of America's biggest trading partners, including China and the European Union. But hours later, on the 9th of April in an abrupt reversal after global markets continued to fall dramatically. The US President Trump announced a 90-day pause on all reciprocal tariffs. This promoted a soaring rally in US markets, which also helped boost Asian and European markets. Trump's partial tariff suspension is pausing new rates on various countries that could have risen as high as 50%, sends out a more positive signal and leaves the door open for talks. But this pause is a fragile one. This 90-day pause means 90 days of uncertainty for all businesses on both sides of the Atlantic and beyond, who are wondering what exactly will happen in 90 days. So China is the exception. US President Trump has decided to raise import taxes on all Chinese goods going to America to 125%, effective immediately, escalating tit-for-tat duties that have piled up between the two countries. However, there has been a recent exception on phones and technological products. According to experts, fears of a bond market catastrophe convinced Trump to hit the brakes. However, Joe Brusulis, the chief economist consulting firm RSMS, has warned that the shift in tariff policy may not be enough to stave off a recession. Goldman Sachs economists projected a 45% chance of recession over the next 12 months. The financial consequences of US President Donald Trump's tariff wars have caused shockwaves across the international markets, with global markets capitalization losing $10 trillion, the equivalent of over half of the entire GDP of the European Union, as reported by Bloomberg. So that is setting the stage for today's debate. I will now move to part one, where we will understand the trade war, the origins, tactics, and the key players. So, Ali Ahmadi, could you briefly describe why you believe the US has launched a global trade war with the rest of the world? Trump seems to be trying to create a self-sufficient American economy, no longer dependent on its chief geopolitical competitors, even if that meant decoupling from $640 billion in a two-way trade in goods and services. Is this wise?
Well, there's been over the last decade, especially, an obvious frustration with global trade and globalization in general among working class people in a lot of first world countries. And this has bubbled up in terms of trade policy in the United States, most of all. In Europe, perhaps you can think about, and the immigration issue. But obviously, these are very much interconnected, right? It's a question of when you look at the world, what do you see? Do you see threats or do you see opportunities? Is it something in between? Obviously, it's shifted for a lot of these countries in recent years. Now, when you think about the United States, this has brought into power folks with some fairly quixotic opinions about international trade policy. Donald Trump, in particular, has a view of sort of a zero-sum view of international trade. If you have a negative trade balance with a certain country, that means that this country is essentially, getting one over on you. It's not this zero-sum mentality takes everything from a kind of cooperative relationship into one that is very competitive and has a lot more rivalry in it than anything else. So over the last week, really since Wednesday, you've seen on a daily basis different announcements from the administration talking about increasing tariffs on China, increasing tariffs on countries, suspending tariffs on certain goods coming from China. I mean, obviously, phones and a lot of these electronic products are the number one things the U.S. imports from China. So then, how are you actually having these tariff measures? The problem is the U.S. administration doesn't necessarily seem to know what it's after. You constantly have senior members of the administration, Bessent and Lutnick, explaining the tariffs and the ration behind the tariffs, and that being nullified by the next announcement the next day. right? You impose tariffs for generally, one of three reasons, right? It's you're trying to reshore industries or protect domestic industries. You're trying to increase revenue through tariffs, or you're trying to create a situation where you can negotiate to get tariffs or trade barriers against you lowered. All of these goals make sense, but you can't really do them all at the same time. If you're trying to negotiate away the tariffs that you're implementing, then that's not going to raise revenue. We've gone sort of back and forth as to what the goal of this is. And ultimately what happened, as you mentioned, was the bond markets, especially the 10-year, 30-year bond markets for US Treasuries, really started to soar at some point. And, that really scared a lot of people. This has happened before. Treasury bond rates were, at close to 5%, if not over it, and at some point in 2023 as well. But those were during economic situations, the inflation and the Fed raising interest rates because of that, not because there's a overall confusion about U.S. policy and a concern, a confidence over U.S. policy making. So that's what seems to have ultimately forced the U.S. to kind of back down and maybe try to find a narrower path specifically against China and others.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ralph. Osa, could you describe for us what is driving the U.S. global trade war? Stephen Miran, Trump's new chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, wrote a paper entitled A User's Guide to Restructuring the Global Trading System. It outlines the intellectual foundation for the Trump administration's trade policy. Do you think it highlights what's driving U.S. global trade?
Thank you, Christina, for the invitation. And I should start by saying that I'm sharing my own views and not the ones of the WTO Secretariat or WTO members. In terms of what are the drivers of U.S. trade policy, I think Ali already mentioned that there's a multitude, of course, of drivers, but one that stands out, if you read the Miran paper, also if you look at the formula for reciprocal tariffs, is of course this focus on trade deficits. So what I thought I could do is maybe talk you through a little bit what tariffs actually do to trade deficits. So I had a blog post a few days ago on that, because that seems to be at the center of the discussion. And here really you have to distinguish between aggregate trade deficits, bilateral trade deficits, and then sectoral trade deficits. So let me start with the aggregate trade deficits. So here it's very simple. As a matter of national accounting, the aggregate trade surplus is just the difference between national savings and national investment. And it's not so complicated to understand. You can just think of yourself. You make some money because you work, and those are your exports. Then you take that money and you buy some stuff. Those are your imports. And if you make more money than you spend, then you save. And it's the same for country as a whole. And the question is, well, what do tariffs do to aggregate trade deficits? And there, most economists would say that these aggregate trade deficits, given that they're driven by savings and investment decisions, are more affected by macroeconomic variables than by tariffs, which is also borne out by the empirical evidence. But that's not to say that tariffs can't do anything to them. You just have to ask yourself, well, what do they do to savings and what do they do to investment? So, for example, if you have high tariffs today, and consumers would expect these tariffs to be lower tomorrow, that might lead to them saving more today in order to have the money to spend tomorrow. Or, for example, if the uncertainty goes up, firms might not want to invest that much, so your investment goes down. So you could also affect the aggregate trade deficit. But these are, of course, all very indirect ways of getting at the savings investment imbalance. There's much more direct ways, for example, dealing with budget deficits at the government level, or also dealing with the savings rates as such. Now, it gets a little bit more nuanced if you start thinking about bilateral trade deficits, because, of course, you can have bilateral trade deficits without having aggregate trade deficits. Right? Country A can have a deficit with B, B with C, and C with A. Nobody has an aggregate trade deficit, but you have bilateral trade deficits. So that you can affect with tariffs. But it's going to be a little bit like this whack-a-mole game in the US. You fix the trade deficit here, it's just going to come up there. Then you hit it here, it's going to come up there. So it's a little bit like that. And then, of course, the third issue is the sectoral one, particularly, I think, goods versus services, We always forget that trade is not just goods, but also services. And the US is is actually the leading exporter of services in the world, has a trade surplus there. So one thing that could happen is if you kind of adjust the goods trade deficit, this might come at the expense then of the services trade surplus. So that's how I would see the economics surrounding this.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So, Ivan, why do you believe the US has launched a trade war with the rest of the world? Do you believe there are any justifications for these actions?
Thank you, Ralph, for your first word, which are already putting on the table many things, and we are going to build upon them for sure. About justifications, who is justifying what? And I think that ultimately, if we take a political consideration, Trump has been democratically elected. So this is something that has to be understood and also accepted. And the way he's behaving at the moment reflects that. He was doing some promises to the American voters. So this is the actions he's taking today they are justified because of that. He was promising something to those who were voting for him. But of course, it is generating a lot of problems for sure when it comes to the America's economic situation. They have been accumulating a lot of public debt, which is not a new thing. It's been growing and growing over the latest decades. We cannot forget that perhaps one of the biggest impulses for this was the oil crisis in 1973, where the oil prices went up 4 times, and then the United States started to accumulate a lot of public debt. We cannot forget the 80s when Ronald Reagan expensive fiscal policies, they were also emphasizing very much this accumulation of public debt. But these are elements that cannot be only considered as the main factors. We also have to think about the social model, the political model. Is this consumerism that is very common in our capitalistic societies in the Western world sustainable? Yes or no? So I would like to put together all those elements in order to better understand how this model has been evolving over the years, and therefore, okay, now he's facing a situation where he must do something. Of course, there is a lot of inertia. There is a lot of history behind that cannot be solved in a short time. And what he is doing in a very impulsive way is trying to show or to demonstrate in a very short time that he can do something. And it's very much linked to this rhetoric of when he was stating that he could be able of putting an end to the Russian-Ukrainian war in one day. So these statements, which are very irresponsible, trying to show to the world that he can set things in very short time, when at the end of the day, when we are talking about economics, international trade, and so on and so forth, we are talking about long-term forces that cannot be solved in a very short time. But from the point of justification, I mean, it's a lot of things.
Yeah. A power play here. This is a global power play. Thank you so much. I'm going to now pass the floor to Ralph again. How do you see the current trade landscape? Is global trade resilient?
One day too early, because tomorrow we're going to come out with our trade forecast, and I know the numbers, but I'm not allowed to share them with you yet. But I can say a few things. So what I can say is that, of course, the extraordinary high tariffs coupled with also the extraordinary increase in trade policy uncertainty, of course, will lead us to a significant downward revision of the forecast. The Director General has already come out with a statement a few days ago, which was just which we put together after the imposition of the reciprocal tariffs. So it's a little bit outdated now because, of course, the reciprocal tariffs have been since paused. But with the reciprocal tariffs in place, what she explained is that we would expect to see a contraction in the volume of world merchandise trade of around 1%, which is around or almost, I should say, 4 percentage points lower than what you would have without these tariffs. Now, I guess 2 comments on that. The first one is an almost 4 percentage point drop. That's really significant. But some of you may think, well, minus 1%. I mean, that's not so bad, even in the scenario which we are not currently in, right? Because it's with reciprocal tariffs. So just to put this in perspective, just so you know, bilateral trade between China and the United States is only 3% of world merchandise trade, 3. And overall US imports are only 13% of world imports. So of course, what's happening now is having a disproportionate effect of China-US trade, and is also having a disproportionate effect on North American trade or US trade overall, which explains why potentially large localized effects then don't translate into these absolutely drastic change in the aggregate numbers. Now, maybe one point also on the reciprocal tariffs. I guess we can talk about it later, but they're particularly hard on least developed countries. But let me maybe come back to that later.
Thank you so much, Ali. Amadi, what is your take on the current trade landscape? Do you believe it could lead to greater political, economic, and social instability? If so, in what way?
There's several aspects to consider. I do think we're in a period of transition in global trade. We were probably already in one just because of the rise of China, different factors that affect that. But you also have you also have this notion that America having the exorbitant privilege, as it's said, of the U.S. dollar centrality, that the idea that that is somehow a disadvantage for the American working class. You're seeing that essentially go mainstream in what Mr. Moran had said in his recent comments and his paper from Hudson Bay. The U.S. is obviously not going to be championing global open trade the way it had after the fall of the Soviet Union. They're actually going to be pushing back on that in many respects. And obviously, you have Donald Trump as president. He will be president for 4 years. But if you look back even at the presidency of Joe Biden did not sign even a single new comprehensive trade deal. He continued certain things that Donald Trump had done in terms of global trade institutions, such as the WTO, certain policies that are not sort of conducive to the work of the WTO. And so this is something, when you have the superpower essentially going in this direction, other countries are going to have to adjust. For one thing, a lot of the global trade system, some of it very much takes advantage of the fact that America does import as much as it does, in large part because it has the global currency. And this is going to have, the United States definitely wants this to change. How exactly it's going to change, it's hard to tell at this point. But certainly, if the dollar slides further, if the dollar, in terms of how much it's used as a medium of international trade, if that goes down, obviously there's going to be a lot of repercussions to that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So, Ivan, what impact does the current trade landscape have on Switzerland specifically?
I think that from this perspective, we understand that everything is very much interconnected. So Switzerland is not isolated, is not that neutral country that is staying in the heart of Europe alone or isolated. Is very much interconnected in the world system. Therefore, this trade war, as we can call it, forces a political discussion in Switzerland to think about the present and the future of Switzerland. And this is a discussion that has been going over the latest years. And we've been talking about the banking secrecy, many of the characteristics and features of Switzerland has been discussed, even the very concept of neutrality, which has been evolving over the years according to the global scenario. So there are many question marks that are out there, and that Switzerland has to reply in order to better understand which is the position in the short, medium, and long term. But when it comes to direct impacts, for sure, I mean, one of the biggest impacts that you can see here is how the Swiss franc gets stronger. And this is not always a positive thing, especially when it comes to exports, because of course Swiss products more expensive, and therefore it is more difficult to get things exported and traded. The other thing could be also related to disruption in the supply chain. As I was saying in the beginning, everything is very much interconnected. Switzerland is a sort of a hub also, where many things are coming from different places, and we are producing high add value kind of products that need this kind of things. So therefore, if there is a disruption on the supply chain, it could have a big impact on Swiss productivity. The other thing which is important also to mention is, what is it Switzerland? It's not only Switzerland as it's a confederation, it's a sum of different cantons. Each canton is different. They have different economic structures, different sectors. One of them are more advanced, less advanced. So it is also very important to talk about regional economics, regional politics, because ultimately Switzerland is also that, how that is affecting at a cantonal level. And on top of that, Switzerland is very well known for big brands, but Switzerland is not only the Glencore, the Novartis, the Roche, the UBS. I mean, if we think at how Switzerland is structured in its economic fabric, the 99% of the enterprises are small and medium enterprises, 99%. So this is a very important to understand and to think about, because we are not talking about the big players in the world. We are talking about the 99% of the economic fabric of a country made of small and medium enterprises that can be very much impacted to that. And of course, they are not as resilient as big companies may have. So it is important to think also in these dimensions, I believe.
Thank you so much. Ali Ahmadi, how did China and other major economies respond to this US trade policies? And what does that tell us about the global economic power dynamics in the world?
Well, the Chinese are obviously very confident right now in general. That's undermined somewhat by the recent problems they've had in terms of the real estate market. But they've been preparing for this for a long time. Donald Trump posted about how China doing tariffs, or reciprocal tariffs on the US was something they were doing out of panic. I can assure you that's not the case. I spent a lot of time in China. They don't really make decisions without commissioning 2 million pages worth of analysis on it. So they have a sense that they are an emerging power, and so Mexico can kind of say, okay, well, we'll give you a few more concessions and keep going. China, because of its position, just can't really do that. Now, in the United States, you have some of the analysis come out. We talked about Mr. Moran. Then the general theory about this from the American side, and Scott Bessent has said similarly. The idea is basically America has the advantage in this trade war because America is the purchaser. So if you're the country that's running the deficits, you are actually in a favorable position compared to the country that needs to sell it, because presumably the U.S. can buy from other places. China can't easily change its, and sell to other places. And this is partially true. Some of the analysis, I've read a lot of analysis from very intelligent experts in Europe about what Europe should be doing about this. And they say, well, we should do more trade with the third world and industrial countries. And China has many of the same plans. Now imagine if everybody's turning their excess capacity onto third world or developing countries. It's not going to go well if everybody's doing the same thing. The problem with the analysis the US has is that a lot of the inputs they are not going to, they come from China and they can't be easily sourced from other places. Obviously, the top line issue, which you've seen some movement on, is the critical materials. Even you have a lot of critical materials that are, China produces a lot of them, but it's the refining capacity in some cases is overwhelmingly in China, and you can't really get them from too many different places. China spent decades working on this. And so they have an economy of scale, and trying to, say, build a refinery for magnesium or rare earth elements in other places is not going to be financially competitive. Never mind that these kinds of plants take, $4 billion in 4 years to build. So this is a kind of problem, and in fact, it's somewhat strange because there are already factories in the United States whose plans for construction has been suspended because of these trade issues, because they need to import factory parts and inputs from China, and they don't know if they can do that. And when the U.S. imposes economic sanctions on other countries, financial sanctions, part of what it's trying to accomplish is exactly this: of sanctions on non-oil manufacturing in Iran and against the Russian military-industrial complex, trying to deny them inputs, including from China. When those sanctions are secondary, obviously they apply to China. And in a sense, the U.S. is not imposing sanctions on itself, but creating a barrier for its own companies, for its people who are doing value-added manufacturing in the United States, to import what they need from a country like China that has cornered the market on so many different important inputs.
Thank you. Just to add to that, China announced that it was suspending exports of a range of critical minerals and magnets used by automakers, semiconductor producers, and weapons builders. And it was a reminder to Washington that Beijing has many tools to interrupt supply chains. So now let me pass the floor back to Ralph. Ralph, how do you see China's role in countering the US? And what do you believe are China's main economic and political motivations behind protectionist trade policies and like tariffs?
Before I get to that, let me briefly pick up on what Ali and Ivan were saying. So in Switzerland, one fun fact, I haven't checked this, but I heard, if you calculate the reciprocal tariff, of course, you take the exports or the imports minus exports divided by imports. And apparently, what's driving this for Switzerland to some extent is huge exports of gold in the fourth quarter of 2024, because what people don't know is that Switzerland and Ticino has these firms, I suppose, that physically trade gold and melt them from one shape into another. And now in this uncertain time, previously people would just trade claims on gold, and now they actually trade the physical thing. And then because it's in one shape in one central bank and another shape in another central bank, someone needs to reshape it. And that's what they do. So apparently that explains a significant amount of the trade deficit. I haven't checked, but I thought it was a fun fact. And then you were talking about importers versus exporters in international trade and who has the power. This is something that has frustrated trade economists for a long time. Economically, trade is all about importing, and exporting is a means to an end, and the end is importing, because this is what gives you utility at the end of the day. What you export is gone from the economy. What you import is what you are actually going to use. And I was hoping that in the pandemic, people would finally understand, because this is really when the concern was, well, I'm not going to get the stuff that I need. But somehow, a few weeks later, they already forgot again. And it's again about export, not understanding this. So I thought there was, it's somehow something that people seem to be impossible to convince of, that it's really the imports that matter at the end of the day. Now, in terms of China, all I can say here is that, of course, that what you see now is the tit for tat logic that is so that is really underlying trade wars, because really, if you think about the economics of tariffs, it's true that a large country has a unilateral incentive to impose a tariff, because you can use the tariff to gain at the expense of another country. Now, the logic then, unfortunately, is that, well, I have this incentive to benefit at your expense. You have this incentive to benefit at my expense. And of course, it doesn't add up, because we can't both benefit at the expense of each other. So at the end of the day, all we do is contract trade volumes, and we are both worse off. And this is kind of where we see this going. I think the Director General already mentioned that in her statement, so I think I can also say that. But with the reciprocal tariffs in place, we are projecting a contraction in bilateral trade volumes between China and the US is more than 80%. This is decoupling effectively. So that's one thing to say. And the other thing to say that is, of course, very important now for China is this whole issue of trade diversion. And there's two sides to it. So one side is, well, what is going to happen to all these other developing countries, LDCs, particularly in East Asia, that are exporting textiles, consumer electronics, and so on to the United States, Vietnam, Cambodia, Bangladesh, all these places, also in Africa, many of them. And of course, I mean, they're in an okay situation now, but with the reciprocal tariffs, they would have a problem. So you see now China or the Chinese president traveling to these countries to tell them, well, you can also export to us. So that's one side of trade diversion. The other one is, of course, well, what's going to happen with all these Chinese goods that were exported to the United States? And that's, of course, a big concern for other countries, including the Europeans have been very, very vocal about that. And I think here the key is just, I mean, this is an issue, but it's an issue on both sides. I mean, if Europe gets hit with high tariffs, then what about all the German cars? They also need to go somewhere. So this, I think, is really the main. This trade diversion is the main mechanism through which this could escalate from a localized issue surrounding the United States into a broader trade conflict. So it's really important for countries to manage these resulting tensions cooperatively.
Thank you so much. Ivan, did the US act as a global leader correcting injustice or as a bully leveraging economic might?
Thank you very much for the question. I pick up from Ralph's comment about the gold refineries in Ticino, which is true. I mean, if you compare the economies in Switzerland, Canton Ticino is not the strongest one. But if we think about the Argo Reus or Valcambi, they are 2 or 3 the stronger gold refineries in the world. So they are doing extraordinarily well these days. It's amazing. But these things seems that they appear under the radar, but it's really happening in Ticino. That. So coming back to your question, well, you have mentioned in your question 2 concepts. One is a leader, a global leader, and a bully. It depends very much of the notion or the concept of leadership that we are considering here. For me, when we are talking about leadership, it's something which is related to a responsible behavior. Of course, there is not one definition which is widely accepted about what leadership means, but at least in my understanding, when I'm talking about leadership, it entails that it is an attribute of responsibility in that. So from this perspective, I don't believe, from my perspective, for my opinion, that it has been behavior as a global leader, correcting injustices, as you have mentioned, because also as Ralph mentioned, these big powers, the big countries can have the incentives to impose unilaterally policies to in your favor, in your benefit, no. So from this point of view, I don't know if I should say it's been a bully, but I will say that it has been acting irresponsibly, according to my concept of leadership, and what I'm going to probably talk more about that later on when we are talking about more the ethical aspect. But from my perspective, it's a very irresponsible behavior.
Ali, in what ways is the escalating export control regime against China, particularly in advanced technologies like semiconductors, reshaping the global tech supply chain and influencing broader strategic competition between the US and China?
Yeah, so the export control world has been really evolving a lot over the last few years, really since 2018, but especially under the late Trump administration and then the Biden administration, where the U.S. has been trying to deny China access to certain technologies they felt might be critical for military affairs. Now, how you go about this, there are sort of in Washington, there's sort of 3 different ways of thinking about this. One is that the U.S. has to figure out a way to come to terms with China and work technologically with China. Those are more sort of progressive voices who are nowhere near power. What the Biden administration favored was a second group of the well represented among the think tank community in the United States, which basically believed that you should have a very high wall essentially built around a small set of technologies. So this is sort of referred to as a short yard high fence. And the idea was that basically you're going to isolate certain technologies, semiconductors, quantum computing, AI, and you're going to focus on limiting China's access to that because of how important they are to the economy in general, and also, of course, China's military industrial development. What we're sort of shifting towards now, it's hard to say how much of this is deliberate or how much of this is just Donald Trump trying to escalate, is that we're going more towards what was a bit more favored by the military, which is one in which there needs to be a genuine disruption of the technological world is part of a larger separation between the US and China so that they're not as intertwined, because from the standpoint of a lot of more national security oriented people in the United States, including certain people who are now in Trump's national security team, if say, for example, China was to invade Taiwan, the United States might want to impose, say, broad secondary sanctions on the entire Chinese financial services industry. They might want to be militarily involved. This can't happen as long as you have this deep economic relationship. So that needs to be sort of altered right now. One other thing that I'd want to bring up, which would be very relevant to Europe and to Switzerland, is that something that we've seen really develop in sort of the late Biden administration, and the Trump administration has also sort of nodded to this, is the idea of basically conditioning access to American technology products based on whether you're replicating American-style export control measures against China and others in your own country's laws. And so there's this sort of country tier system where, you know, some countries have full access to U.S. technology. Others, including even like NATO allies like Turkey and Portugal, have limited access in certain respects. And this seems to be what the U.S. Commerce Department has decided is a solution to the ability of not having trouble getting other countries to go along with their edicts. So this is, I think, something you're going to see increasingly more of over time, and I think the Europeans have to try to figure out how to deal with that proactively.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We're going to launch now into part 2, consequences of stabilizing global trade. Could you kindly, Ralph, tell us about the terms of trade theory of the WTO and how does it work?
I can be relatively quick on that because I think I already explained the basic logic. Of course, I mean, a big question is, you know, why do we even need trade negotiations? Because most people think, well, if they've taken an economics class, you know, isn't free trade good? So, you know, if it's so good for me, then why do I need to wait for you to reduce your tariffs? And the answer is, well, it's not that simple, even though mutual free trade is typically a good thing from an economics perspective. As I was explaining before, there's still unilateral incentives to deviate from it, and this whole discussion that you see in the press now about or the whole question about who pays for a tariff, I think is really relevant there. Is it the domestic consumers or is it the foreign producers? And the truth is, if you're a large country, it's somewhere in the middle. Domestic consumers pay a little bit, foreign producers pay a little bit because you have some market power. And this is exactly what gives you this incentive to deviate from free trade unilaterally. So they have a point there. But of course, what this so-called optimal tariff argument forgets is that you benefit at the expense of another country, and the other country wants to do exactly the same thing. So if I try to make you pay for my tariff and you make me pay for your tariffs, again, the end is that we all worse off and we don't trade that much anymore. And this is precisely why we need trade policy cooperation, and that's precisely why we have institutions like the WTO.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And Ali, I wanted to ask you, what do you believe will be the short-term and the long-term economic impacts of the US-China trade war on American consumers and businesses?
Well, so what tariffs do is they're inflationary, right? Obviously, if you can't buy the cheaper product from abroad, you have to either pay the tariffs on top of what you're paying, or you have to buy from a domestic manufacturer that is more expensive. But it also results in a certain amount of loss of specialization, a lot of value-added manufacturing that defines sort of global supply chains is not possible if you can't import. I think Ralph did a good job of explaining that why imports are actually much more important than exports, despite our national debates about trade always being defined by exports. Imports define your position in global value chains, so they're particularly important. Now, with the United States, what this means is you're with already weaknesses that existed that I think are somewhat downplayed in a lot of American political conversations. I don't think the U.S. economy was doing as well as some of the data publicly about it showed it to be, both in terms of growth and obviously there's still certain underlying inflationary factors the Federal Reserve acknowledged still exist. So then you add tariffs on top of that. This is before Donald Trump even took office. So now you add tariffs on top of that, and you're looking at a situation where the economy could stagnate, it could go into a recession, and at the same time you have inflation. And the problem with that is that the Federal Reserve, like central banks, usually has a model where it can, in order to deal with inflation, it can sort of get money out of the economy by raising interest rates, bringing inflation under control, or it can reduce the interest rates at times of low economic growth and get the economy growing. But if you have both of those problems at the same time, that sort of what's called the spare tire rule is not an option, because you're going to try to fix one by exacerbating the other problem. Now, this it might not be the deepest recession, it might not be the most inflation, but when you have two of them together, that's a really big problem. The last time the U.S. had this problem in the early 1980s, they implemented what was famously referred to as the Volcker Plan. From the former Fed chair, Paul Volcker, that basically had a massive escalation of interest rates to get inflation under control. And then you lower interest rates over time in order to see if the economy can grow in a low inflation environment. But it creates a lot of short-term pain. You are putting the economy into a recession on purpose. Even Besant was the Secretary of the Treasury, was talking about how people forget how bad it was when this plan was being implemented. That farmers obviously depend on borrowing a lot, which is hard to do when rates are high. One farmer showed up to Washington D.C. with a shotgun, looking for Paul Volcker. So it does create a lot of pain. Now, I still believe that Donald Trump himself, say nothing of a lot of people around him, Donald Trump himself wants a deal with China. That he is more focused on the economic ramifications of the U.S.-China relationship than on some of the great power competition stuff or the issue involving Taiwan. Things have, I think, escalated a lot more than either China or Trump necessarily wanted. This exemption for digital products, for say phones and whatnot, that was introduced recently, that is an exception, that is not an exception, that is it's very confusing how they're framing it. But this seems to be a bit of an olive branch towards China, even if it was really meant as like a concession to Apple and Nvidia. But this might help us get into the negotiations Donald Trump wants, which would be phase 2, which would be the successor to the phase 1 they negotiated before, which it did not go so well. But this, the phase 2 they're talking about isn't just about like China buying more American soybeans or something like that. They want to talk about currency manipulation. They want to talk about intellectual property. They want to talk about certain things that are kind of foundational to the Chinese economy. So this isn't as simple as just buying some more stuff from America. So these are going to be difficult trade negotiations, but I do think that's the direction that Donald Trump ultimately wants to go to.
Thank you so much. Ralph, how did the trade war affect international supply chains, and how will it impact the EU in particular, especially as regards tech and the agricultural sector?
Thank you, Christina. So again, the detailed projections will have to wait until tomorrow. But maybe just two topics I think that are of particular relevance for Europe. One is the issue of trade diversion. I think I already talked about this, where it's really, really important to find a cooperative solution, because I can really see this get out of hand. But then another really interesting thing to watch out for in the context of Europe is really services trade, which is related to the tech point that you're raising. Because at the moment, the trade tensions, well, first they are contained geographically because they're related to US trade relationships, but also so far they're related to, I mean, they're limited to goods. But the EU has said publicly that it's also considering to retaliate on services, and is also, as you know, investigating some of the US big tech firms anyways, like for other reasons. So that's another risk, at least to our forecast, that we will be issuing tomorrow, that it could not just proliferate geographically, but it could also just proliferate sectorally. And the US has a strong position in services and tech, of course, so they may also be vulnerable there.
Thank you so much. So Ivan, given that Switzerland is not part of the EU, should it align with the EU in responding to US trade pressures, or should it adopt a more neutral, accommodating stance toward the US? What are the strategic and economic implications of either approach?
Thanks a lot. As I said earlier, I think that Switzerland, especially today, faces a special moment when it has to reflect deeper about its identity, what Switzerland was in the past, what Switzerland is today, what Switzerland is going to be, considering that there is everything very much interconnected. And nowadays, with this turmoil even more, there is even more need to reflect about this identity. And as I said, that there were many issues, many features that characterized the Swiss identity in the past and now have to be somehow rethought. It is always very difficult to find the right formula. It is like a little bit like walking on the slack line, no? So you are trying to maintain the balance. There is a little bit of wind here, a little bit of wind there, and you're trying to maintain a certain and eventually arriving to the other extreme of the slack line, right? So from this point of view, Switzerland has been undergoing difficult negotiations with the European Union. For the last years, that has been an evident thing. All these discussions between Bern and Brussels about how to do things together. Switzerland trying to maintain this concept of neutrality. The European Union demanding more from Switzerland. It has been emblematic the way how the research funds were cut some years ago, and few days ago they were somehow approved again. So there is another example of how these difficult negotiations between Switzerland and the European Union are somehow getting a bit together, and these research projects, especially for Swiss universities, are very important. So this is a news from the latest dates. So when it comes after that, when we consider trade, we can consider which are the main export partners of Switzerland. And of course, we are talking about France, we are talking about Germany, we are also talking about the US. When we are talking about the important partners, we are talking about, again, Germany, France, Italy, and China. So how are you going to play with those different interests? So this is going to be an interesting point. It is interesting, and this is something that was released in media the few days ago about this call Karin Keller-Sutter had with the Trump's administration, and the Washington Post. I think they were saying, oh, this call from Karin Keller-Sutter was decisive, or was very important to convince Trump to open up these 90 days. So Switzerland is there, and they are trying also to make an impact on that, and for sure, the way how Switzerland wants also, Switzerland it's announcing to the U.S. administration that they have plans to invest massively in the American market. So, of course, this is something that has to be seen over the next months, how Switzerland is able, and as a country has been also always very pragmatic, trying to stick to the values, to the identity of the Swiss Confederation. But it is true that it's a context in which this political debate, it's very important, and it is decisive for Swiss future to better position itself, and I think with a lot of pragmatism, but without losing the characteristics, the identity that Switzerland has been always having.
Thank you so much. Ali, Ahmadi, I wanted to ask you what strategies could be used to de-escalate current future trade conflicts and while protecting domestic interests?
Yeah, I mean it's a tough question because we never had really trade conflict on this level for some time. I think Ivan did a great job explaining some of the fundamentals. What I would add is, you know, you need to approach the Trump administration understanding the Trump administration, both Donald Trump's sort of personal attitudes about these things. There has to be a bit of a notion of retaliation without necessarily being confrontational. There has the different battles going on inside the administration have to be understood, and who, if you could choose who to negotiate with from the administration, you know, Besant, rather than say Jameson Greer or some of the more sort of hawkish people that are the authors of some of these policies. But I would also say that, you know, it seems that the trade system, the global trade system, is moving from one that is relatively institution and rules and norms based to one that is more based on sort of a balance of power. And you know, about where the leverages are going to define how you know, the trade world is ordered. And in that midst, Europe, I think, has, you know, with Switzerland and a lot of the even non-EU members involved, has an opportunity to try to pull it back into some level of having rules and institutions define the situation. Because it's, I don't think, for, you know, the United States, maybe you could think it can act otherwise. China obviously wants a rules-based system, but wants some revision of what the rules are. But I think that you know, Europe and Switzerland, and perhaps even with the UK, need to have some vision for how they want things to go forward. Prime Minister Starmer basically just said, yeah, no, Trump is right about the fact that what we've been doing so far, it is not working. And maybe he is right about that. Either way, there are a lot of elected governments that seem to feel that way in one form or another. So there needs to be some notion of what comes after this, that might be able to stave off the extent to which this simply becomes a you know, a balance of power war between different countries, because that is definitely going to be a lose-lose proposition for almost everyone, probably everyone, and definitely for Europe and Switzerland, that are so built around you know, international trade.
Thank you so much. And Ralph, building on what Ali just said, to what extent do you think the ensuing trade war will encourage other countries to adopt more protectionist policies themselves? And is it more effective to negotiate trade reforms through multilateral agreements or through economic pressure tactics like tariffs?
I think I already mentioned one channel through which I think these trade tensions could propagate, which is the trade diversion. So I think that this might just induce other countries to also impose, doesn't even have to be tariffs, you know, safeguard measures of some sort. So let me not dwell on that. I think another thing we would be concerned about is not just the level of tariffs, but is also the type of tariffs that are imposed. And what I have in mind is that Article 1 of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade is MFN, so the most favored nation article, which means that you're supposed to, whatever tariff you impose against one WTO member, you're supposed to impose the same one against all others. The one exception is free trade agreements. So if you have a zero tariff mutually, you know, that is okay. But otherwise, MFN is kind of the one of the cornerstones of the organization. So one risk, of course, that one can also see is that countries now, in response to this situation, start offering unilateral concessions without appreciating that they would have to extend them also to other countries on a non-discriminatory basis, and that further undermining the credibility of the system. And speaking of credibility, I think it's one point that I haven't really made yet that I want to briefly make. It's not just about the tariffs as such, it's also about the uncertainty. I mean, just the threat of a tariff increase itself, even if there's no tariff at all, has huge effects on trade flows. And in fact, this is something we model also in our forecast. So it's not just about the tariffs. Now, in terms of where to address this, I mean, obviously, you would expect me to say this, but I also believe it. The way to address it is really in a multilateral setting, and we have the perfect place just down the road, which is also where discussions are happening. So people are getting together, trying to see how they can respond.
Thank you so much. And Ivan, I know we've talked a lot already about Switzerland and how this will impact Switzerland, but specifically for the business sector, what has these new global trade tensions caused to Swiss business, and especially in terms of exports, investments, and supply chain stability?
Yeah, thanks for the question, and I connect with what Ralph said a few seconds ago related to the uncertainty. So it's not only the application of a certain policy, tariffs, or tightening the trade, but it's also the question of the uncertainty, which is very much linked to a political communication that is very fashionable today, and it's very irresponsible today, and it's having a direct impact on business leaders and the way they have to make decisions ultimately. So this is a very important thing. And we cannot forget that Switzerland, it's a leader worldwide in innovation. There are many reasons why Switzerland has been consolidated this position as a world leader in innovation. So the thing is, how is it going to be possible in a context of uncertainty to maintain this position of innovative country when it comes to attract talent and so on and so forth. So it is also true that this issue of the uncertainty is also having or generating opportunities for Switzerland or for Europe in general, where many scholars, some scholars from the US might be escaping US universities because they feel like I have to go somewhere overseas, and that could generate also a positive impact when it comes to innovation and strengthening the role of Switzerland as a leader innovator. So there are downsides of these negative impacts, but there are also opportunities linked to this big turmoil. And I think that Switzerland has the resilience, has the symbolic power in order to keep on being, as I said, resilient to maintain this position. And of course, I mean, we talk about exploring new markets. If we are talking about one of the latest free trade agreements Switzerland has done, it's been with India, but it took 16 years to the negotiations for this free trade agreement. So it's a very long time. So perhaps the negotiation in the future towards exploring new markets can be quicker and faster in order to diversify that. So yeah.
Thank you so much. And we're going to now move to part 3, the ethics of trade war versus free trade. So Ivan, back to you. Can the US be considered a fair player in global trade if it unilaterally imposes tariffs to achieve its goals? And if the goal was fairness, was the method fair? And what alternatives could have achieved the same ends without a global fallout?
Yeah, well, this is a very interesting question. When it comes to the capitalist system in which we're living, when it comes to the global trade, I mean, we are talking about the greatest examples of international cooperation. And this international cooperation and trade as such, as I can consider as a communication vector. If you open up, you have trust, you develop trust, you work on this certainty, things were better. But this system is based on multilateralism and consensus. So the very essence of this system is precisely that, the way how decisions can be made multilaterally and through consensus. If we are talking about a player which is very strong, and has a lot of power, military power, economic, financial power, normative power, however you want to call it, and is transcending the very principle of multilateralism and deciding things unilaterally, I think that ethically speaking is not fair and equal. So this is some of the principles that have to be taken into account. So and again, it's not a question of developing that unilaterally, thinking about your biggest threat that could be in this case China or whoever, but also how does it is impacting on the smaller economies, which may have less leveraging power or less bargaining power vis-a-vis stronger economies.
Thank you so much. And you just gave me some idea too on how we see now with the US is it's leveraging its economics with its security guarantees. And we see, again, is the US being an ethical power in this sense? And it's also enforcing its economic standards on other nations. So how do you see this?
Well, I mean, I think that certainly from the American standpoint, and I think this is sort of broadly true, is a lot of these systems that we have in the international community, they create some level of consistency, they create some level of predictability, and I would certainly 100% agree that these how we structure international trade needs to happen in some level of a multilateral setting. And that would be, best for everyone. But from the standpoint of a country like the United States, part of these is the sort of the global order, whether we're talking from a security standpoint and economic standpoint, is to lower the cost of hegemony. It allows for countries like the U.S. to create a series of norms based on their own point of view that allows for that allows for countries to be brought into line in certain respect. That is obviously advantages to being the superpower, to being powerful countries of the world. I mean, even people like Joseph Nye, who are very much advocates of American power and see it as very benevolent, will acknowledge that, well, if the global superpower was Zambia, the global order would look different. It depends on the individual country, but for the United States, there has to be some sense of reciprocity, because it is we talked a little bit about Moran's views on all of this. The thing is that he at a certain recent speech he made, he talked about America's exorbitant privilege, the power of the dollar, as being, a burden that America has to, that burden has to be shared by other countries, that so other countries should send a check to the Treasury Department, he actually said, to finance this. And this is, obviously the fact the dollar is what it is, means that the US can borrow recklessly without these debts really coming due. The basic rules of economics don't really apply to the US the way they do to other countries that would have a huge, balance of payment crisis if they were to borrow this much money. But it also means the US has this tremendous amount of sanctions power, and it gets to essentially outcast countries from the international economic system by doing this. And this is sometimes things that European countries have agreed with. Sometimes, like with Iran in 2011 to 2013, sometimes European countries haven't agreed with it, like with Iran in 2018. So it's despite the fact that the U.S. has had this power, ultimately at some point it just feels inevitable that they're going to go further with it if they feel like their needs aren't being met. But if I think the pressure from the international community is going to have to be negotiation in a multilateral setting, not these kinds of individual ad hoc. President Trump said the U.S. is negotiating with 75 different countries. That doesn't seem to be going on. A lot of countries are saying we're actually reaching out to the U.S. and we're not getting anything. We're not negotiating at all. Also, how do you negotiate when the rules are changing every 5 minutes? If they've been changed every day. So these are difficult to say, but this bilateral approach, I don't even really see how it's in America's interest, never mind sort of the interest of the global trade landscape.
Thank you so much, Ralph. This is more probably an ILO question than a WTO question, but do trade wars disproportionately hurt vulnerable populations, low-income consumers, farmers, factory workers? And if so, what could be done to protect them better?
It's an ILO question, I would say, because if you think about, what's the whole point of the WTO? The whole point of the WTO is to replace a power-based system with a rules-based system. And of course, it stands to reason that the powerful are winning in a power-based system, which makes the rules-based system particularly valuable for developing countries, least developed countries, and so on. I think that's the basis. That's the basic and most fundamental point. I already mentioned, I talked a little bit about the LDCs, the least developed countries, but I think that's also really, really important at the moment with reciprocal tariffs suspended. I think they are okay because they can, in fact, take advantage of some of the space that the tariffs on China leave in the US market. But if these reciprocal tariffs come into place, this is going to be devastating for the weakest of the weak. I mean, think about Lesotho. They have, I think, 30,000 people working in denim factories making Levi's jeans. And people from the administration had even said, if I remember correctly, that they don't even know that country. And now they're getting hit with 50% tariff. And these are people that don't have much outside options. So, of course, from their perspective, very hard to understand. And then if you think about the distributional impact of tariffs within countries, so we can talk about the jobs too. That's a long discussion, but I think one point that is easy to make is that poor families tend to be disproportionately exposed to trade because they just buy more traded goods. I mean, just think about who goes to Walmart in the US. It's typically the poorer people, and where does Walmart get all the goods from? Well, they are imported. And that's why they're so cheap. So clearly, tariffs are a regressive tax. I think most economists would agree with that, and therefore stand to harm the poor both within a country as well as in the international context, particularly.
Thank you so much. And Ali, I wanted to ask you, can free trade be considered ethical, even if it enables exploitation of cheap labor and environmental degradation in developing countries? And should wealthier nations have a moral obligation to support the trade practices, even if it means higher costs at home?
Well, I mean, the thing is that there were plenty of economists, I think economists more associated with, like, for example, the labor unions in the United States, who back in the 1990s, when the trade deals were being negotiated with Canada and Mexico, NAFTA specifically, they were saying, the trade is not a bad thing. We're not opposed to trade. The problem is that these trade deals have no provisions for labor protections, have no provisions for environmental protections. And the thing is that the best way, and this applies to a lot of different fields, including when you bring laborers into your country, like you're in the Gulf states, for example, the best way to protect your own workers is often to protect the workers of other countries, right? If the investors and corporations in your country cannot freely go and exploit labor, treat people poorly, pollute as much as they want, then the incentive to go abroad diminishes, at least to some extent. And if certain trade deals that were being negotiated in the 1990s and so on took these under account, I think you would have had just better outcomes in general. You would have had, third world economies that are less inclined to just be export driven and more inclined to develop more domestic sort of consumer economies. You would have it would be a better deal for workers in the United States, who are now sort of eagerly promoting a lot of, Donald Trump and his cabinet, and supporting the head of the UAW, the labor union for the auto industry in the United States. Actually, Sean Fain actually came out and supported this, despite being a very ardent progressive activist. Came out and supported the tariffs on cars. The one other issue that I'd point to in terms of the fairness of this is how dangerous this sort of race to the bottom can get if we're going beyond multilateral rules-based systems and it's free for all. The critical materials are going to be an even bigger deal now. How you're going to wrestle away China's dominance in terms of refining is a whole other thing. But there's a lot of countries that have critical materials. Critical materials are not, every country comes out and says, oh, we have $15 trillion in critical materials. They're not lying about that. They might be right. It's just getting them out of the ground and creating commercial mining operations for them is a little bit easier said than done. Ukraine, for example, it doesn't really have very much that's interesting, but officially you can say it's a massive number. But if there is a a free-for-all in terms of China, Europe, and the United States going down to Africa, South Latin America, a lot of the Middle East, a lot of these different places, and trying to engage in corruption, trying to play whatever games necessary in the name of national security and whatever else to try to get these materials for themselves, create exclusive contracts and whatnot. That is going to create an extraordinary exploitative situation. And so that there does need to be some way of putting some bottom on that. We've already seen the United States suspend the enforcement of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, basically just a green light for American corporations to go abroad and bribe people. This law has been in place for a long time. A lot of American executives actually liked it because it was a good excuse for why they can't give a bribe when a foreign official is asking for one. But now this has basically been suspended by the Justice Department. So things can get really bad really fast if there isn't some effort to create a bottom under it. And Europe is Europe is not going to win this knife fight over global. And China and the U.S. are both much better positioned for this particular kind of competition. So yeah, there is definitely a need to establish some sort of multilateral frameworks around this.
Great, thank you so much. Back to Ivan. Is the principle of America first compatible with global ethical responsibilities in trade, or does it undermine collective progress?
I think that this connects very much to the very notion of nation state, the modern and the contemporary notion of nation state today. What is a nation today? What is countries stand for today? And we are now sitting here, it's April 2025, and we are talking about all these things. We are all thinking about, we are on the brink of this, whatever, Third World War things, and we are repeating the same things. If we have some historical memory, we can think about the big trade openness between the 1849 and the 1875, ended up with the banking crisis in 1907, which preceded the First World War. Then another expansion on the 20s with the crash in Wall Street again. A few years later, the Second World War. So it makes me reflect about history, right? So it seems that we are always keep on repeating the same mistakes, and it's not that history repeats itself, but history at the end of the day is a human-made product. So it is our mindset which are not changing, the things that are getting us back to discussing the same things over and over. And that reminds me, in 2010, I was invited by the NATO Parliamentary Assembly in Rome to address a speech on migration. And I remember he was sitting on my left side, the former Minister of Domestic Affairs, the Italian one, Roberto Maroni, and I was telling in front of the whole audience, let's be very careful about how do we develop these narratives, because we can end in very few years, according to history, on the brink of the Third World War. And the answer to that was a big laugh. This is not possible. So we are somehow repeating and keep on repeating the same mistakes and the same errors, which are very much linked to that. And is it something that cannot be reverted, cannot be modified? I think that the America First concept, in my idealistic, humanistic, naive point of view, should be changing to humanity first. And the nations, the countries should be working for that. So I don't think that this idea of the America First is contributing to the global, to the collective progress, by no means.
Thank you so much for reminding us of this very important history. Now, let me move to you, Ali. Again, I want to ask you about the global war on trade, especially its impact on the war in Ukraine. Obviously, sanctions have been a major factor in that conflict, but how will the landscape now change, according to you?
Well, the importance of the U.S. dollar as being the primary reserve currency of the world is the foundation of America's capacity to impose economic and financial sanctions. Now, that has slid to some extent in terms of the money, the Federal Reserve, in terms of how Federal Reserves hold value. A lot of them have been switching to, for example, gold for the last number of years. But the overwhelming majority of trade, about 80% of all trade, is still conducted in US dollars, which is an enormous source of power. What you've been seeing over the last couple of over the last week, as we've alluded to earlier, is the idea that the U.S. basically it seems to me like the part of what the Donald Trump administration was trying to accomplish is to tank the stock market on purpose so that a lot of the money would flow from the stock market into the bond market. Whenever there is problems in the global economy, you see U.S. bonds. The yields go down because people are looking for a safe haven asset. And so they buy treasuries, they put their money in dollar denominated assets. And so even in 2008, when it seemed like the US housing problems was crashing the global economy, everybody was still trying to get their hands on dollars and American treasuries. And also another aspect of that is that a lot of countries depend on swap lines with the Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve to shore up their own positions. So they actually become more dependent on the United States, which creates a point of leverage pertaining to some of the trade talks, perhaps. Maybe that's something they were hoping for. But that didn't happen. Instead, the bond markets were going in the opposite direction. The yield on 10 and 30-year treasuries was going up dramatically. And this is something that has partially been alleviated now that the Trump administration has come out with these exemptions. You have, there were some treasury sales. They were sold some bonds over the course of the last week. By all accounts, it seems to have gone fairly well. The Japanese were dumping some bonds. Apparently, that's no longer the case. But the Minneapolis Fed, which does a lot of macroeconomic research, said that there clearly is a lot of risk points around this still after this last week. This is when it is caused by the fact that there's a lot of concern about the decision making of the U.S. economy, and caused by basically there's a risk premium being put on dollar denominated assets that wasn't there before. This is going to mean in the long term, certainly if this trend continues, and you have erratic decision making by the United States, the ability to impose financial sanctions is going to be limited, and there's going to be more opportunities for at least parts of the global economy in which the dollar is not as important, which is precisely what countries like China, Russia, Iran, and a lot of countries that are either under a lot of sanctions or facing a lot of sanctions or do business with countries that do sanctions. What they've been trying to create for some time in the form of like de-dollarization is to create some sort of sphere in which a lot of trade can happen outside of the dollar system, not necessarily to overthrow King Dollar, but this might be the direction things are going in some extent. It certainly is going to mean China is going to be much more emboldened to engage in de-dollarization projects and work with countries that are sanctioned.
Thank you so much. I'm going to open the floor now to questions. Would anyone like to ask a question? Yes, please go ahead.
Question is directed at Professor Assert of WTO. Now we all know that the Marrakesh Agreement, Article 12, gave special emphasis on least developed countries. I know you mentioned it, but and WTO has been applying special and preferential treatment, have been promoting that for LDCs. And of course, the enhanced integrated framework has also been specifically addressing the problems of LDCs, including quota-free and whatever free and tariff for LDCs. Now, what I wanted to know, because a number of the LDCs, like Lesotho and Madagascar, they've had huge percentage of tariff of the Trump administration. What is the mood within WTO in relation to this? And how are these countries reacting? Because after all, Lesotho built its textile industry because of the American AGOA, African trade, and which was encouraging African countries to produce for the US market. And that's what Lesotho has been doing. And because of that, it is slammed with such tariff. I mean, how does WTO view this? I know it could be seen as bilateral, but is there any thinking or thought or within WTO?
No, there's a lot of thinking and thought, and also a lot of concern, because I share your assessments that many of these most vulnerable economies have been threatened with particularly high tariffs that could have devastating consequences for the economy. There's a bit of a reprieve now, as I explained, so I think they bought a little bit of time, but of course the uncertainty is still there, and also the risk is still there. And this is, in fact, I think, one of the issues around which members are currently consulting, how they can help these countries navigate these difficulties, because I do think the environment has changed. I mean, I don't know what the future of the African Growth and Opportunity Act is. We've all heard about the changes to USAID. So this is really not just from that particular angle of the reciprocal tariffs, but more broadly a very difficult situation. Where I can say that this is really one issue where members are trying to find some sort of solution in the time that we have now.
Thank you. Thank you. I have three wonderful questions too that I'm going to ask the panelists from our online participants. So first of all, to Ali, do sanctions risk becoming self-defeating if parallel networks emerge and traditional powers lose leverage over global logistics and reserves?
Yeah, I mean, the de-dollarization efforts, the de-dollarization efforts have been going on for some time with limited results, right? Actors around the world become there's very strong network systems that keep organizations like SWIFT, organizations like the various dollar clearing areas that are domiciled in Western countries they're the ones that handle a lot of this, and switching to other networks becomes inherently more costly and more difficult. There's an influx in global trade issues, and everything that's happened over the last week definitely presents certain opportunities. For the United States, it's certainly going to try very hard to hold on to its power. Donald Trump certainly understands the importance of the dollar in terms of economic sanctions. He certainly loved using economic sanctions during his first term. We certainly expecting more of that in his second term. But at the same time, the level of unpredictability that's introduced into markets creates opportunities for a lot of different actors to create alternative networks. And part of this just has to do with trends that are already existing in terms of how you use sanctions in the context of great power competition. Sanctions were traditionally, over the 2000s and 2010s, America got everyone very comfortable with the idea of imposing very aggressive sanctions unilaterally, because it was said, well, we're imposing these sanctions against fairly small countries due to various circumstances, and so it's not going to damage the global economy too much. When you're imposing these same sanctions against countries like Russia and China, what we've seen is it becomes very difficult. You never had the same number of sanctions imposed against Russia as against a country like Iran. But there are a lot of designations by Canada, by the EU, by the United States, but not the secondary sanctions that go after other countries that are doing business, like going after Indian refiners that are buying Russian gas. That never really happened because of how integrated Russian hydrocarbon is into the global economy. And, obviously with China, there's similar concerns. You would have a massive trade crisis around the world if, say, China's big four banks were ever sanctioned. And the U.S. has considered doing these things, but can never do it, and is essentially holding back the option.
Thank you so much. We have one more question in the audience.
Harry, I have a parallel line of thought. Like, as you mentioned, the de-dollarization, because Trump is trying to fight that de-dollarization. Don't you think this entire drama of geopolitical psyops or geoeconomical psyops led by the US government with China and the rest of the world, it's basically just to pull China on the other side from the BRICS so that there shouldn't be any de-dollarization fear in his government?
I don't think that is possible to pull China away from its de-dollarization efforts. China ultimately understands that it has a lot of vulnerabilities to U.S. sanctions. All the export controls have made that very real. to the Chinese. So they are very aware of this, and they do want, they wanted more power in the World Bank and the IMF because of their larger economic heft. The US said no. So building a quasi-alternative system with, the AIIB and all these different with BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization becomes how China approaches its lack of representation in existing international bodies that have been created after World War II. And it understands the dollar, its use of the dollar is a major vulnerability to it in this respect. So I don't think the US is under the impression that they can actually peel China away from such efforts. Those are, if anything, everything they're doing right now is making it more imperative for China to go in that direction.
Thank you so much. So I have one last question to Ivan Giuretta. What skills, mindsets, or ethical anchors must be for the next generation of leaders be cultivated to avoid falling into this cycle of coercive economic strategy disguised as playbook logic?
All right. So when it comes to ethics, sorry.
No, you don't need them. You don't need them.
I don't need. So when it comes to ethics, it seems that it's something very theoretical, the noble principles. But at the end of the day, a principle becomes noble when it's practiced. We cannot hide from that. The other thing is that, and that makes me reflect about this aspect of responsibility. So we have a responsibility. How do we put ourselves in front of the events we have in front of us? How do we deal with that? Do we feel ourselves that we are victims of a system, or we can or have the responsibility to try to change things? And it comes to my mind an episode that happened almost 1 year ago. I'm about to finish a book with Professor Edward Freeman, who is the father of the stakeholder capitalism. And I was talking to him, and how can we tackle this book? Because this is polycrisis thing, and he told to me something very, very interesting and opened me mind and said, the best thing of criticizing something is proposing something better. So at the end of the day, the skills are very much related to the courage. The sense of, okay, we have a responsibility, we have to make a responsibility, we have to develop new narratives. And that is very important to do. Dare to write new narratives.
What a great ending. I just wanted to maybe let all of you, did you want to chime in one last final thoughts, or shall we close?
Happy to, but don't have to.
Okay, great. I had one last question for you. How do you see future trade practices? And I think that was probably your last words.
Yeah, so we don't predict trade policy, of course, but at the same time, strongly believe and also know from our analysis that there are great benefits to trade policy cooperation, and that a non-cooperative approach to trade policy making at the end of the day doesn't benefit anyone. So my hope and prediction is that we will ultimately get back to that.
Thank you so much, and we look forward to reading your report tomorrow. And thank you for trying to hold back, but still sharing some of your ideas with us today. So I would like to now close this session. Thank you so much for all of you who have come in person. Delighted to see all of you. I hope to see you all next month on the 12th of May, when we will have another debate on technology and security, looking at India Unplugged, technology, security, and new partnerships. But before I close, I want to thank all those people who have helped a lot to make this event happen, who are instrumental. Vasiliki Kadansky, thank you so much for your role. Mareva Rodriguez, Florian Golay, Joan Gilles Antoine-Delayan, and Laura Elbas, and Mariana Gonzalez, who has kept the people online happy. So please come back on May 12th. We look forward to seeing you again. But let's give our esteemed speakers one last round of applause. Thank you so much for your insight.